state system. The predominant nationality in the Ottoman Empire were the Turks. The Turkish feudal lords formed the ruling class. Their power was maintained through an apparatus of coercion with the Sultan at its head. The Sultan, or Padishah, was the supreme head of the state. He wielded absolute military and civic power. In the 16th century he became the Caliph, the spiritual head of the Muslims. The second person of importance was the Sheikh el-Islam, the head of the Muslim clergy. The legislation, the court, the madrasas, collegiate mosques and huge ecclesiastical estates were concentrated in his hands. The Sayyidis, judges, the Qadi Askari, military judges and the Muftis, expounders of the religious law, were under his control. The Muftis in each large center of the empire headed the local clergy. It was they who decided whether legislative enactments were in conformity with the principles of Islam. The first multi in the Ottoman Empire was the Sheikh el-Islam himself. The theologians and scholars, ulama, were also influential strata of the Muslim clergy. The empire's central government was called Bab el-Ali, the Sublime Porte. At its head stood the first minister, or the Great Vizier, who from the time of Suleiman the lawgiver had held the title, Sadr-Azam. He directed the whole state administration. The Great Vizier was always accompanied by a Defterdar, who was in charge of the land register and the distribution of the fiefs. The most important issues were decided by the Sultan himself. In urgent cases the Diwan, council, was convened. The Diwan was made up of senior generals, viziers and other dignitaries. The army occupied an exceedingly important place in the life of the military feudal Ottoman Empire. It was based on the knights, Sipahi, who had to live within the boundaries of those districts in which their timars were located. Each district was called Sanjak or Liwa, banner, and the knights who lived there formed a combat unit of the Ottoman cavalry. In event of war, they assembled their cavalry under the banner of the Sanjak Bey, the commander of the district, who commanded them as well as the knights of his own Sanjak. Each province, Pazhalik or Eyalet, embraced several Sanjaks. A province and its levy of knights was commanded by a pasha, or bey of beys. Apart from the levy of knights, many pashas had their personal feudal militias of Mamluks and mercenaries, usually Maghrebs. The Ottoman infantry corps was made up of Janissaries, from the Turkish Yenisheri, new troops. This was a privileged corps of professional infantry formed in the 14th century. It was recruited mainly from young captured Slav boys, who were forcibly converted to Islam and given a military training. They had no families, were cut off from the local population and served the Turkish Sultan zealously. The Janissary Corps was divided into nuclei with the Ghaz at their head. They enjoyed a number of privileges. At some time during the 17th or the 18th century, the Janissaries obtained the right to settle down outside the nuclei, to marry and raise a family, to engage in the crafts and in trade, while continuing to offer military service on a hereditary basis. Thus a special Janissary stratum was formed from which the Sultan's guard and the military police formations were recruited for the purpose of exacting taxes and duties and for suppressing revolts. Many towns and provinces of the Ottoman Empire, Serbia, Algeria, Tunisia suffered cruelly from the outrages of the Janissaries and often came under their complete control. The Janissary dominance was felt even in the empire's capital, Constantinople. Apart from the knightly cavalry, the Janissaries and the mercenaries, the Turkish sultans and their deputies resorted to the help of warlike tribes, whose role was especially important in the far-flung parts of the Ottoman Empire. The Turks imposed their administrative system on the Arab countries. Syria and Palestine were divided into 4 Pazhaliks with centers in Aleppo, Damascus, Tripoli and Saida. At the end of the 18th century, Akka was also made a Pazhalik. The region of the city of Jerusalem was set aside as a special Sanjak. In Iraq, there were only 2 Pazhaliks, Mosul and Baghdad. In Arabia, There were also to the Hejaz and the Yemen. Egypt, Tripoli, Tunisia and Algeria were independent Pazhaliks. The Somalian seaboard was an independent province of Habash from the middle of the 16th until the middle of the 18th century. The territory of the Lebanon preserved its autonomy under the government of the Arab emirs. The Sultan's deputies enjoyed unrestricted power in their own domains. The central government did not bother its governors with petty instructions. According to their own judgment, they levied and collected taxes, distributed estates, administered justice and reprisals, commanded their troops and waged war on their neighbors or rebellious vassals. There were no strong ties between the provinces. Outwardly, the Ottoman Empire was a centralized state. In reality, it was decentralized. It lacked internal economic cohesion and national unity. Actually, it was a conglomeration of countries and peoples united under the sword of the conqueror. Hence the existence of centrifugal forces which slowly but surely pulled the empire apart. The decay of Ottoman feudalism. At the end of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire entered a period of serious crisis, which affected all branches of social life. The economy was ruined. The machinery of the state had decayed. The provinces would not obey the center. The demoralized army had lost its fighting efficiency. Culture had declined. Marx and Engels compared Turkey with the decaying carcass of a dead horse which supplied the neighborhood with a due allowance of carbureted hydrogen and other well-scented gaseous matter. Marx and Engels. British politics. Disraeli, The Refugees. Mazzini in London, Turkey. New York Daily Tribune, April 7, 1853. This crisis was called forth by the decay of Ottoman feudalism. Feudal production relations made the further development of the productive forces impossible. Moreover, they led to the destruction of the existing productive forces. Turkey and her Arab domains were agrarian countries and their main producer was the peasant. He practiced small-scale farming on his own plot by his own labor using primitive implements. The basic law of this economy was simple reproduction. Part of the harvest, which comprised the essential product, was used for the reproduction of the primitive means of production and manpower. The other part, which comprised the surplus product, was completely appropriated and used by the feudal exploiters. With the growth of money-commodity relations and foreign trade, the appetites of the feudal lords grew also. Sumptuous palaces were erected in Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo and other urban centers, which received luxuries from all over the world, imported by enterprising European and Eastern traders and paid for in kind with the products of the local peasant households. But the needs of the feudal lords continued to grow, and more goods had to be supplied. Feudal plunder assumed catastrophic proportions for the peasant household. Villages emptied, crops were abandoned. Fields which had until recently been tilled were infested with burnt bushes and more than half of the land lost its fertility. Famines were frequent. The principle of collective responsibility was strictly followed in the village. If a peasant family died out, its taxes had to be paid by the neighboring peasant household. If a whole village died out, its taxes were paid by the neighboring village. This system hastened the ruin of the Arab village. The greater the damage done to the peasant household, the fiercer was the struggle of various groups of feudalists for the right to exploit it. The struggle for fiefs and estates became more intense. Big feudal lords, Hayani or Kibari, seized the land of the petty knights. Gomerji, the ideologist of the last Kochi Beys, who died about 1650, wrote indignantly about the growing power and prosperity of all sorts of scoundrels, about their seizure of the Timars and Ziamets, the owners of large and small estates, who were the real warriors for religion and the state, have been deprived of the means of existence and not a trace of them is left. While seizing the military fiefs, the nobility declined military service. Their example was followed by the same petty knights whose fate was lamented by Kochi Bey Gomerji. Previously the Sultan had once been able to recruit from 100,000 to 120,000 vassals, whereas in the 17th century only 7,000 or 8,000 went on campaign. Most of them were mercenaries and servants. The vassals avoided military service but strove to retain their own lands. In this period we observe the tendency to turn military fiefs into hereditary privately owned estates. This process, which was accompanied by the ruin of the peasant household, undermined the very basis of the Ottoman Empire's might, the army. This struggle for the right to exploit the ruined peasantry spread throughout the Arab countries. In the 18th century, it became more acute due to the decline of piracy and to military defeats which deprived the feudal lords of their main source of enrichment. Insurrections of the Arab sheikhs and emirs against the pashas became more frequent, as did the revolts of the pashas against the Porte. Internecine wars flared up and feudal separatism increased. The majority of the Arab provinces became virtually independent of the Turkish Sultan and passed into the hands of the local feudal cliques, whose leaders strove to break away from the Porte altogether and to found independent dynasties. In Baghdad, the dynasty founded by Hassan Pasha was firmly established. This dynasty ruled throughout the 18th century. At times, when it exerted power over the Mosul governors, its authority extended over the whole of Iraq. The Mutasalims, many of whom also held the title of Pasha, were subordinate to the Baghdad Pashas. All attempts of the Porte to depose this dynasty met with failure. The Pashas appointed by the Porte could not hold out in Baghdad more than a couple of months. The Kulemens won overthrew and killed them and proclaimed the next pretender of the Hassan Pasha dynasty, the new Pasha. In 1780, power in Baghdad was seized by Suleiman the Great, Bayek, the Kulemen leader. He founded a new dynasty, the dynasty of Kulemen Pashas, which ruled in Baghdad until 1831. The Baghdad Pashas had their own court modeled after the Sultan's court in Istanbul, with the same large harems and covetous courtiers, numerous servants and fantastic oriental luxury. The same went for Tripoli. The Janissary dynasty of the Kulemens white slaves converted to Islam, who underwent military training. They formed the army's crack troops, rulers, guard, like the Mamluks in Egypt. Karamani Bey ruled from 1711. This dynasty was virtually independent of the Porte. The Hussein dynasty in Tunisia began to reign in 1705. It was founded by Hussein Bey ibn Ali. Under this dynasty, Tunisia became a fully independent state only nominally under the control of the Turkish sultans. The Ottoman Empire. In Algeria, power became concentrated in the hands of the Janissary freebooters, who turned the country into a virtually independent feudal state. With the help of the local feudal lords and sheikhs of the warring tribes, the Janissary commanders laid the nomads and the peasants under tribute, gathered large taxes to their own advantage and seized land. A council of Janissary army generals elected from among themselves the governor of Algeria of the day, a life appointment, which could not be inherited. Under the Dey there were 4 beys, who stood at the head of the provinces into which Algeria was divided. In the middle of the 18th century, power in Egypt was seized by the Mamluk beys, who pushed the Janissary nuclei into the background. According to Volney, the Janissary nuclei turned into mobs of vagrants and ruffians. The administrating of the country passed to the leader of the strongest Mamluk clique known as Sheikh el-Balad, who made himself ruler of the whole country. The Pasha became a virtual prisoner of the Mamluk beys and, as Volney writes, was deprived, banished and expelled. The first governor of Egypt in the 18th century was Ibrahim Bey, 1746–57, who himself was not a Mamluk, but being a Turkish bey, a Kiakia, he was able to form a Mamluk detachment and seize power with its support. His Mamluks were generously rewarded with estates and posts and many of them were appointed beys. A fierce struggle for power ensued after the death of Ibrahim. It was won by Ali Bey, nicknamed Al-Kabir, the Great, who, in 1763, became ruler of Egypt and 6 years later proclaimed Egyptian independence. In 1773, He was assassinated and power passed into the hands of the rival Mamluk clique headed by Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey. Feudal separatism and internecine wars thus led to the downfall of the vast Ottoman state, which had come into being not as a result of economic development, but as a result of the military requirements of Ottoman feudalism in the course of its predatory wars. This state, like many other multinational states of Eastern Europe, arose within the framework of feudalism before the formation of nations and the liquidation of feudal disunity. The forced union of different peoples at different levels of development into a vast state was not durable, and the contradictions between the feudal structure of the society with its inherent centrifugal tendencies and the centralized form of the Turkish state led to the inevitable weakening of the Ottoman Empire. The decline of the outward might of the Ottoman Empire. Grave internal crisis signified the beginning of the ruin which was to envelop the whole Ottoman Empire. The former might of the Sublime Porte was shaken. In the 15th and 16th centuries, from the military point of view, the Ottoman Empire was the strongest state in Europe. It gained many victories and added many countries to its domains. Its army of Janissary infantrymen and knights was considered invincible. But now the knights and Janissaries would no longer fulfill their essential military obligations and went unwillingly to war. Industrial development in Europe had brought a marked improvement in military weapons and in the art of war. The Turkish army, however, remained at the level of the 14th and 15th centuries. Consequently, the Ottoman Empire passed from victory to defeat, from the offensive to the defensive, and from expansion to territorial losses. At the end of the 17th century, Turkey suffered her first serious defeat. Her war against Austria, Russia, Poland and Venice ended in 1699 with the signing of the Treaty of Karlowitz, which gave Azov to Russia, Podolia to Poland, Central Hungary, Transylvania, Bačka and Slavonia to Austria, and the Moray and several of the archipelago islands to Venice. Soon Turkey regained the Moray and temporary control of Azov. But according to the Treaty of Passarowitz, signed in 1718, she had to yield the Banat and part of Serbia to Austria. The 1739 Treaty of Belgrade wrested Azov and Kabarda from her control and declared them neutral territories. The barrier in 1774, the long Russo-Turkish War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Kuchul-Kainarji, which gave Russia Kerch, Yenikali, Kinburn and also the region of Kabarda. The Crimea and the Kuban were declared independent of Turkey. Soon, in 1783, they were also joined to Russia. The Kuchul-Kainarji Treaty also gave Russia the right to navigate the Black Sea and the Straits for commercial purposes. By the Treaty of Jassy in 1792, Russia gained the whole northern seaboard of the Black Sea and the mouth of the Dniester, which became her border. In 1812, by the Treaty of Bucharest, Russia received Bessarabia. In her struggle with Turkey for the Black Sea and the Balkan Peninsula, Russia was driven by the economic requirements of her landowners and merchants. Russia's commodity economy was growing. The landowners and merchants needed an outlet to seaports that did not freeze up in winter in order to ship wheat, wood, hemp and furs to Europe. The importance of the Black Sea for Russian trade was increased by the fact that many of Russia's great rivers flowed into it. But the Black Sea was in the hands of the Turks, and the outlet from it, the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, was firmly closed to Russian ships. The question of capturing Constantinople was also connected with Tsarism's desire for hegemony in Europe. The Austrian landowners and merchants were also seeking an outlet to the warm water seaports for their growing export trade. Hence Austria's desire to gain possession of the Adriatic Sea and the Danube basin. Austrian expansion crossed and in many respects coincided with Russian expansion. This led to conflicts between the two countries which, however, did not keep them from reaching agreement on the division of Turkey. England and France were also eager to gain control of Istanbul, the Straits, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Syria and Iraq. These claims were made in the 18th century, but actual fighting began in the 19th century. With the further development of capitalism, the solicitations of the European powers in the Near East became more persistent and the struggle between them for the division of the Ottoman Empire more fierce. The fate of the empire's domains, known in history and literature as the Eastern Question, was central to European diplomacy in the 19th century. Popular movements and the Arab countries' struggle for liberation. The yoke of the Turkish feudal lords, sultans, pashas, janissaries and knights, evoked many insurrections by the peoples of the Ottoman Empire. These insurrections reflected the main class contradiction between feudal lords and peasants as well as the main national contradiction between the oppressors and the oppressed. The feudal yoke in the Ottoman Empire bore the stamp of foreign domination, so the peasant struggle against the feudal lords went hand in hand with the national liberation movements. The bourgeoisie, which in the 18th century was taking shape as a class in Greece, Serbia and Egypt, also suffered from the Ottoman feudal yoke and joined in the struggle against feudalism. Generally speaking, there were two kinds of movements. There were popular movements in Turkey herself, directed against the feudal yoke. These were supported by the oppressed nationalities and in the main assumed a class character. On the other hand, there were movements of the oppressed peoples. These were more like national liberation movements. Among the popular anti-feudal movements in Turkey proper were the uprisings headed by Badreddin Simawi in 1415–18 and the Karayizici uprising at the turn of the 16th century. The uprising of Badreddin Simawi spread over a huge area, from the Balkans to East Anatolia. In his fiery speeches Sheikh Badreddin Simawi, the leader, inveighed against the exploiters, preached universal equality, the liquidation of class oppression and the communal use of property. He called for the unity of the working people of all religions and nationalities. In the ranks of the insurgents Muslims fought side by side with Christians and Jews, and Turks side by side with the Greeks and Slavs. The geographical boundaries of the Karayizici uprising were even greater. It included the Balkans, Asia Minor, northern Syria and Iraq. The insurgents seized Baghdad and held it for many years. The Arab fellahin and Bedouins took part in the uprising together with the Turkish peasants, the petty knights and several pashas. Like the Badreddin movement, the level and the scale of this uprising placed it in the same ranks with the Wat Tyler, Thomas Munzer and John Huss uprisings, with the French Jacquerie and with the liberation wars of the Russian peasants. The uprisings of the oppressed peoples were no less persistent in character. The main centers of the anti-Turkish liberation movements were the Balkans, Transcaucasia and the Arab countries. Although in some cases the leaders were feudal lords, in principle, the movement assumed a profoundly popular character. One of the main centers of anti-Turkish resistance in the Arab countries was the Lebanon. In 1516, the troops of Salim the Cruel had seized the Lebanon and the mountainous regions of Syria and Palestine. The administration of the country had been entrusted to Fakhreddin I, an emir from the Ma'anid dynasty who recognized vassal dependence on the Porte. His attempts to avoid paying tribute, however, irritated the Turks, who in the end decided to establish direct authority over the country, but were met with fierce resistance from both the Lebanese peasantry and the feudal lords. A long stubborn struggle ensued. In 1544, Fakhreddin was poisoned at the court of the Damascene Pasha, and his son, Kirkmaz, like many other representatives of the Lebanese nobility, was killed fighting the Turks who, in 1585, launched a punitive expedition against the Lebanon. A new stage in the resistance began in 1590 with the advent to power of Kirkmaz's son, Emir Fakhreddin II. This loyal pupil of Machiavelli, a Druze, who made himself out to be a Christian when opportunity offered, was a clever diplomat and master of intrigue. He had spies in Constantinople, at the courts of the pashas and even in the homes of his vassals. He plotted and sowed discord among the enemy. Seeking the favor of the Sultan, at first he paid a high tribute into the Turkish treasury and shared the spoils of war with him. For this the Sultan appointed him ruler of the mountain and coastal districts of the Lebanon and considerable parts of Syria and Palestine. The ultimate purpose of the emir's plan was a crusade against the Sultan with the help of the West. Preparing for the struggle against the Porte, he started talks with the Italians, began the construction of fortresses and brought the strength of his army up to 40,000 men. In 1613, he provoked a rebellion in which the whole population of the Lebanon took part. However, the Turks emerged victorious. Fakhreddin II was compelled to flee from the Lebanon and spent 5 years in Italy. His pompous oriental suite and enormous wealth held Europe spellbound. As a diplomat, he was less successful. His plans to knock together an anti-Turkish coalition with the participation of France, Florence, the Vatican, the Maltese Order, and others failed. Upon the accession to the throne of Osman II in 1618, Fakhreddin II was granted an amnesty and returned to the Lebanon. Having regained his domains, he mapped out a plan to develop them economically. He encouraged foreign trade and to a great extent Europeanized the country. Beirut was split up into boulevards after the European manner and new buildings were erected. A group of young people was sent to Italy to study. This was the beginning of Maronite spiritual education. It promoted the European study of Arab philology. At the beginning of the 30s, Fakhreddin II once again inflamed the people to rebel. He was taken prisoner and sent to Constantinople as a hostage. In 1635, disturbances flared up again. Fakhreddin II was executed and his principality routed. Arab opposition to Turkey, however, continued. Throughout the 17th century, two hostile groups of the Lebanese nobility had been fighting each other. One group, the Kaisites, or Reds, as they called themselves, led by the Mohammed family, came out against local Turkish domination and gained a following among the Lebanese peasants. The other group, the Yemenites, or Whites, led by the emirs of the Alamaddin family, was supported by the Turks. Varying fortunes attended the struggle. More often than not, success favored the Kaisites, who established authority in the Lebanon many times. In 1697, after the Mohammed family had died out, the Kaisites were headed by emirs from the Shahed family. In 1710, the Turks, together with the Yemenites, made one more attempt to settle accounts with the troops of the Kaisite emirs. Having overthrown Emir Hyder Shahab, they planned to turn the Lebanon into an ordinary Turkish province. In 1711, however, the Kaisites crushingly defeated the Turks and the Yemenites in a battle near Ndar in which all the members of the Alamaddin family perished. The Turks were compelled to renounce their plans and for a long time did not interfere in the Lebanon's internal affairs. One of the most serious attempts of the Arab rulers to free themselves from the hated Ottoman feudal yoke and win independence is connected with the Russo-Turkish War of 1768–74. The diplomacy of the European powers, especially Tsarist Russia, in its desire to weaken Turkey, supported the national liberation movements on the Balkans and in the Arab countries. The leaders of the insurgent forces, in turn, sought an alliance with Russia, hoping to gain their ends with our help. In 1769, taking advantage of the war with Russia, the ruler of Egypt, Ali Bey el-Kabir, declared his independence of the Turks. A Mamluk of Abkhazian origin, Ali Bey had for long sympathized with Russia and concealed his hatred for the Porte. In 1770, he declared himself sovereign and assumed the title of Sultan of Egypt and the Two Seas. His name was mentioned in the khutbahs, sermons of the Egyptian and Hejaz mosques. In 1770, the province of Hejaz was added to his domains. To get help in his struggle against Turkey, Ali Bey entered into an alliance with Sheikh Zahir, the ruler of Safad, a region in Palestine. For many years this Kaysite had been engaged in extending the domains presented to his father by the Lebanese emir. Around 1750, having obtained the small coastal settlement of Akka and turned it into a large center of sea trade and handicraft production, he moved his capital there. He then restored an ancient fortress of the Crusaders in Akka and converted it into an impregnable stronghold, which was later to withstand even the forces of Bonaparte. Zahir used the huge revenues gained by extortionate tax farming and the granting of monopoly mainly to equip his army. Its combat strength reached 60 to 70,000 men and fleet. Having broken away from the port, Ali Bey decided to secure the aid of Russia. At this time a Russian squadron under the command of Count Alexei Orlov was stationed on the archipelago. Having destroyed the Turkish fleet in the famous Battle of Cheshme on June 25–26, 1770, the Russians established their supremacy at sea and seized several of the archipelago islands, having actively supported the rebellious Greeks. At the beginning of 1771, special emissaries of Ali Bey arrived at the headquarters of Count Orlov on the island of Paros, where it was agreed to start a joint struggle against the Turks. At first Ali Bey was successful. In 1771, the Egyptians with the support of Zahir's troops began a formidable campaign in Syria. They took Damascus, Saida and besieged Jaffa. However, the treason of the Mamluk generals completely changed matters. Abul Dahab, who commanded the Egyptian troops, suddenly withdrew his Mamluks from Damascus, fortified his position in Upper Egypt and started a struggle against Ali Bey. The majority of the Mamluk Beys defected to Abul Dahab. Ali Bey was defeated and fled to his ally in Akka. After the loss of Damascus, and the departure of the Mamluks, Zahir's situation became more precarious. The Lebanese emir, Yusuf Shahab, joined the Turks and with them besieged Saida. At the request of the Allies, a Russian squadron, under the command of Rizzo, arrived in Syria. It helped break the blockade of Saida and seized Beirut, May 1772. In the autumn of 1772, having concluded a truce with the Turks, the Russian squadron left Syria. Once again Beirut passed into the hands of the Turks. In the meanwhile, Count Orlov sent to Ali Bey a mission headed by Lieutenant Pleshkayev, which handed over to the insurgents a large consignment of weapons and ammunition. In 1773, having reorganized his forces, Ali Bey with his 6,000-strong army came out against the rebellious Mamluk Beys. In the battle near Salatia, however, in the eastern part of the delta, his troops were defeated. Ali Bey was mortally wounded, taken prisoner and soon, on May 8, 1773, died in Cairo. Sheikh Zahir's situation was now critical. True, in June 1773, the truce between Turkey and Russia ended and once again a Russian squadron, under the command of Kochukov, arrived in Syria. The Lebanese emir Yusuf Shahab broke with the Turks and entered into an alliance with the Russians and Sheikh Zahir. After a 3-month siege, the Russians captured Beirut. In October 1773, Yusuf Shahab requested Catherine II to make him a Russian citizen and establish a protectorate over the Lebanon. After the signing of the Kluchuk-Kainarji Treaty in 1774, this petition was rejected and the Russian squadron left Syria. When the Russians departed, the Turks threw all their forces against Sheikh Zahir. In 1775, he was besieged in Akka and soon killed. The revolt was suppressed and the capital of Zahir, Akka, became the residence of the Turkish satrap Jahazar, whose name is associated with the darkest days in Syrian history. Jahazar, the butcher, his real name was Ahmed, was of Bosnian origin. He had embarked on his Mamluk career in Egypt, where he had earned the nickname of Butcher by ordering several massacres. During the Russo-Turkish War he organized his own Mamluk detachment to fight the Russians. For his outstanding services in suppressing the Zahir rebellion, he was appointed the Pasha in Saida. Soon the Paschalics of Tripoli and Damascus were also handed over to him, and he became the virtual ruler of Syria with Akla as the center of his domains. The reign of Jahazer was remarkable for the unprecedented brutality with which one rebellion after another was suppressed. In 1780, a spontaneous peasant movement, supported by some of the local nobility, started in the Lebanon. At its head stood certain relatives of Yusuf Shahab, who had once again gone over to the Turks. The insurgents rebelled against the heavily increased tribute that Jahazer had imposed on the Lebanon. The revolt was brutally put down. Yusuf Shahab cut off his brother's tongue, plucked out the eyes of his other brother, and with his own hands killed one of the Shahabs who had gone over to the insurgents. The Janissaries fed their prisoners with human flesh. This was followed by the brutal suppression of the rebel lions of the Palestine Bedouins and Fellahin of Saida. A continuous struggle was waged in the Lebanon, where rival feudal cliques roused the peasants to revolt with promises of an easier life. The most serious rebellion against Jahazer began in 1789. The insurgents seized Beirut, Saida, Sur and approached Akka, but treason, committed on the part of some of the feudal leaders, bribed by Jahazer, led to the defeat of the revolt. In 1790, in the Lebanon, yet another rebel lion was sparked off by discontent among the peasants and internecine strife among the nobles. The rebellion began to die down only in 1797, when Yusuf Shahab's nephew, Emir Bashir II, who had fought against his uncle, gained a foothold in the Lebanon. In 1798, a big rebellion took place in Damascus, the inhabitants of which refused to pay tribute to Jahazer. Somehow, the Porte managed to settle the conflict by appointing a new pasha in Damascus. However, the disturbances in Syria continued. In Iraq, uprisings took place throughout the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. These were movements of Bedouins and semi-settled farmers, whose life was still based on the tribal system. The insurgents upheld their rights to the land and rose against the feudal system imposed by the Ottoman Turks, refusing to pay taxes to the Turkish authorities. The pashas replied by sending military expeditions to collect taxes from their rebellious subjects, with the result that wars between the pashas and the tribes continued almost without a break from year to year. The local feudal lords, Kurds and Arabs, played an ambivalent role. At times they would help the pasha to pacify one tribe or another, usually for a generous bribe, but often they headed the tribal anti-Turkish uprisings. To this picture of internecine wars and rebellions were added the Persian raids, fighting against Turkey as against their permanent enemy. The Shahs of Persia supported any anti-Turkish action in Iraq, whether tribal rebellions or the campaigns of the pashas. There were times in the 40s of the 18th century when the Pasha of Baghdad fought against his own sovereign together with the tribes and the Iranian Shah. The 3 centuries of Ottoman rule in Iraq witnessed scores of large-scale rebellions. One of the most significant was the uprising of the tribes in southern Iraq under the leadership of the Said family. It started in 1651 in the district of Basra. The insurgents captured Basra and held it for many years together with the adjoining regions. Only in 1669 did the Turks succeed in putting down the rebellion and installing their own deputy in Basra. In 1690, an Arab rebellion of the Muntafik tribes flared up, embracing the valley of the lower and middle Euphrates. The Arabs occupied Basra and conducted a successful campaign against the Turkish troops until 1701. Even then the Turks failed to suppress the rebellion completely. With the support of the Iranian Shahs, the Muntafiks offered stubborn resistance to the Turks in the 18th century. At the end of the century, a fresh wave of popular uprisings swept southern Iraq. They were put down by the Baghdad Pasha, Bayek Suleiman. These numerous uprisings and internecine strife weakened the Ottoman Empire. Feudal anarchy reigned in the domains of the Sublime Porte. The popular movements and uprisings of the Arabs, Greeks, Kurds, Armenians and Slavs shook the decaying foundations of the feudal empire and hastened the collapse of a reactionary feudal system which had outlived itself.